This is part one of a two-part video on Parmenides. We saw that some of the earlier pre-Socratics were monists. So, for example, Thales thought that water was the one thing, the arche, the one thing that existed. And we saw that with Heraclitus to a certain extent, definitely with Anaximenes, and also with Anaximander. But Parmenides takes it to an extreme. First of all, just a little bit about the background of Parmenides. He was born around 515 BC. He lived in Elea, so this is a distant portion of the ancient Greek world in contrast to the Milesians and Heraclitus being from Ephesus. This is on the west coast of Italy, so we're about as far away as we could be and still be in the ancient Greek world. The most important pre-Socratic philosopher was Parmenides. His life was associated with Xenophanes, with Pythagoras, and Socrates. A dialogue that Plato wrote has a conversation of Socrates with Parmenides, of course, titled Parmenides. But we're looking at, as much as we can, the works of Parmenides himself. He does have some poetry, and he does have some appeals to authority. So he begins by this very visual experience, kind of a vision that he describes with a goddess and a chariot and screeching wheels and fire and interesting things going on. But I'm not going to spend any more time on that poetic part of his writing. Instead, I want to look at the philosophical portion because we can see some very interesting arguments in Parmenides, and these are greatly influential then on Socrates and Plato. He does have more extensive writings than the other pre-Socratics, so we don't have to speculate as much about what the rationale for his views may be. So even though he did write in poetry, we do have arguments that we can understand and follow. One of the major claims of Parmenides is that there is no change. So we've talked about how other pre-Socratics are driven by this desire to explain change. And what Parmenides has concluded is that the project of explaining change with a single arche has been exhausted. Right? So they've tried water, they've tried air, they've tried fire. Interestingly, no one tried earth, but also the apeiron, some unbounded substance that wasn't one of the four basic elements. So those have kind of been exhausted, but Parmenides thinks that they all fail because there is no change to explain. Change is an illusion of sorts. So he's not proposing this as a theory to explain what he observes, like many of our other pre-Socratic and other philosophers do in general. Instead, he comes to this conclusion as a result of a deductive argument. So he doesn't look around and say, there is no change, I don't observe any change. Of course, that's not what he does. But he has some reasoning that leads him to this conclusion. You might say that Parmenides is one of the first pure rationalists, right? His motivation for doing philosophy comes from a strictly rational perspective, right? Relying on careful reasoning. Certainly he was influenced by Pythagoras and the emphasis on mathematics. He saw that we can do math through pure reasoning. We don't have to go out and investigate the world to do math well. And so that's his approach to philosophy. We have this statement, it is, right? One of the briefest, I guess it is the smallest, most significant sentence in philosophy. For what it's worth, right? This is a very interesting sentence. You may not think so, right? It is. It seems very simple. But we have to consider what it refers to. Now, there are a few alternatives here. It could refer to being, kind of this general universe that exist, the one thing, the being that exists. It could refer to whatever exists, kind of collectively, the universe as we typically think about it, all the stars and the galaxies and the planets, etc. Or you may think of it possibly as a variable, any object of inquiry whatsoever. So this would be roughly the idea that we use in, for example, algebra. So we use sentences like x squared equals 9, and we're not defining x in that particular sentence other than giving it the characteristics that it has in the predicate of that sentence. But the idea of the variable wasn't yet used in ancient Greek philosophy. Now, I would say clearly the second option here is not what Parmenides is talking about. One, the idea of being is probably the best way of thinking of it. But I think the third option does apply to a certain extent. Just because they didn't have variables yet doesn't mean that Parmenides didn't have the rough idea yet. So that's it. What about the is part? In fact, our language uses is in a few different ways. A former president famously asked what is means. Right? So he was asked a question, and his response was, well, it depends on the meaning of is. And though he was laughed at, in a sense, there is a reasonable question behind the idea of what does is mean. So it could be predicative, right? This is a normal way that we use the word. So we might have the sentence, the president is from New York, and the is always associated with another term or phrase when we use it in this predicative way. So we have a basic sentence structure of X is blank, right? So the is the connection between the subject and the predicate. So we can assign a characteristic or a trait to the subject. Very natural, very normal use of the word is. A second way that we use is that is fairly common, but not as common as the first way, is identity. So we might have this sentence, which in 2019, when I am recording this, is true. The president is Donald Trump. Now, what we mean here is, you could replace is with the equal sign, right? So X equals whatever you're talking about, right? So when we say the president is Donald Trump, we're identifying those two things. We're saying whatever the president is, that is Donald Trump. So we know if Donald Trump is in the United Kingdom, the president is in the United Kingdom. Everything that is true about one is true about the other. And then we have the use of is that refers to existence. And this is probably the meaning that Parmenides has in mind. It's the least common way that we use the word is. But suppose somebody says this sentence, there is an armadillo in our backyard. Well, the is there is affirming the existence of an armadillo, right? So it's not that rare to use it in that kind of way, right? There is peanut butter in the cupboard, right? We use sentences like that fairly commonly. The kind of way, though, that Parmenides uses it, a little bit more nuanced than that. So, for example, a conversation between A and B, and someone says, oh dear, she has ceased to exist. And the response is, not so, she is. The response is, the person is affirming the existence of the individual in question. Now, derivatively, the word is the same word in different uses as am or be. And so we have this sentence, tell them I am sent you, which God said to Moses when he wanted the name of who is sending him. And the I am there is very interesting theologically, but it seems to be an affirmation of being. Or Hamlet's famous line, to be or not to be, should I exist or not exist, right? And we're using the word be, which is basically the word is in another form. That is probably the use that we have in mind. So I'm suggesting this sentence, it is one in which Parmenides is saying being, exists. That's a plausible way of understanding it. Now, what Parmenides goes on to do then is he collapses common modal distinctions. So typically, we have modal distinctions. There's a difference between possibility and being a matter of fact, and there's a difference of necessity, having to be a certain way, and just being a certain way contingently. Those are modal distinctions. Well, Parmenides says if something is thought of, it must exist. Now, typically we would say that doesn't make any sense. I can think of a flying car that I have, and no such car exists, right? Well, why does Parmenides think that things that are thought of must exist? Well, there's some reasoning behind it. If something is thought of, it must exist or not exist. Right? It has to fit into one of those two categories, but it cannot not exist, for it is being thought about. Right? So we rule out the not existing. It has to be there to be thought about. So if it's possible to think about it, then it is possible for it to exist. That seems a very reasonable and plausible idea. Most people seem to agree with that one. But anything that can exist then must exist. So we have, if something's thought of, it has to either exist or not exist. It cannot not exist, so it has to exist, and that means it must exist. So anything that can exist must exist, and so we conclude that which can be thought about must exist, right? So Parmenides collapses these normal modal distinctions that we have. So here are the consequences of his ideas. You have conceivability on the one hand. If you can think about something, well, for Parmenides, that's the same as possibility. Now that step is arguable, but fairly reasonable. However, he collapsed the distinguish between something being possible and something existing, right? Because of the reasoning we just considered. So conceivability means it's possible, which means it exists, and which means it must exist. It's necessary existence. And then on the flip side, if something doesn't exist, it cannot be conceived, and it's not possible for it to exist. It's impossible. And so we have this breakdown of our typical modal distinctions, and Parmenides says there are no modal distinctions. So that's the end of part one.